Before the story begins, don't forget, if you love tales where humanity's courage reshapes the galaxy, hit that like button, drop a comment about your favorite HFY moment, and subscribe for more epic sci-fi adventures. Every click helps this story reach more dreamers like you. Now let's dive in. The chamber's air shimmered with heat as the verdict was read. Vast wings curled against the high stone walls of the council amphitheater, where elder dragons sat coiled in glittering rings, their eyes reflecting judgment sharper than blades. At the center, shackled in chains of auric alloy, stood Kilira. Her scales bore the pale shimmer of mother fire, dulled by the council's restraints, and at her feet nestled 3 fragile hatchlings. They whimpered against the marble floor, their tiny wings twitching as if to hide beneath her shadow. Kilira of the Crimson Line, boomed the eldest dragon, his voice echoing through the hall like thunder rolling across cliffs. You gave birth out of season. You have broken sacred law. By decree of the council, you are stripped of clan and title. You are to be cast beyond our borders, your brood denied recognition. Kilira lifted her head, amber eyes glowing with the unbroken fire of defiance. My hatchlings are innocent, she growled. You punish them for the rhythm of my body. Tell me, is law worth more than life? The council hissed in collective disapproval, ancient jaws clattering in disdain. The decree was not argued, nor could it be. She was forced out, dragged across the starlit halls by hunters in gleaming armor, her hatchlings clutched against her chest. The gates of the council opened and exile began. Far from the amphitheater, in the rust-colored dust of an abandoned mining belt, a man worked alone. Ethan Cole sat in the belly of a broken freighter, his sleeves rolled up, grease smeared across forearms hardened from years of service. He was no longer a Marine, though once he had worn the armor. Now he was a mechanic, the kind who could coax dying machines to live again. A torch hissed in his hand as he welded a cracked fuel conduit, sparks bouncing off the deck like fleeting stars. His ship, a patched-together hauler that looked more like scrap than vessel, floated quietly inside the asteroid belt. Few came this far. Pirates prowled the trade routes, and the council rarely bothered with forgotten mining claims. That suited Ethan. Out here he could earn a few credits repairing whatever wreck stumbled into his path, no questions asked. The silence shattered when his sensors screamed. A colossal form cut across the void, wings outstretched, trailing chains that glimmered faintly against the light of distant suns. Ethan squinted at the monitor. At first he thought it debris, then a warship, then, his breath caught. A dragon. The myths he had half believed as stories in barracks, scaled titans who lived among the council races, unfurled before him. She was wounded, wings beaten raw, scales scarred where restraints dug deep. She staggered through the vacuum as if dragged by gravity heavier than space itself. Around her clung smaller shapes, hatchlings writhing in confusion. Ethan did not think long. Training from another life whispered against his ear, "Don't hesitate." He fired thrusters, steering his hauler toward the drifting beast. His comm crackled static as he hailed, though he doubted she spoke his tongue. "This is Mechanic Ethan Cole. You're burning out. Let me help or you won't last another rotation." Kilira's eyes narrowed, molten spheres gleaming even across the void. She had heard of humans, fragile, reckless, said to break beneath the pressure of true power. Yet here one flew closer instead of fleeing. Her hatchlings mewled, frightened and hungry. Pride told her to ignore him. But pain spoke louder. She allowed her body to drift toward the waiting hauler. Docking clamps groaned as Ethan wrestled her massive frame into place along the ship's spine. His vessel quivered under her weight, alarms shrieking that bulkhead integrity was seconds from collapse. Ethan ignored them, bolting down stabilizers by hand, running from console to console until the shaking stilled. When the airlock cycled, heat poured inside as if a forge had been unleashed. Kilira lowered her head, horns scraping the ceiling. Ethan stood before her, human frame a fraction of her shadow. His voice came steady, though his heart pounded hard enough to echo in his ears. "You're bleeding energy through those chains. Whoever clamped you wanted you weak. I can cut them off." Her snarl filled the chamber, sharp teeth bared inches from his face. "Why risk yourself, human? Do you not fear being crushed, burned, devoured?" "Fear's not the same as running," Ethan replied. He lifted his welder. "Besides, I've worked on worse. Ever tried patching a mining reactor mid-breach?" For the first time in days, Kilira's lips curled in something that wasn't fury. Perhaps not quite amusement, but surprise. Slowly, with the dignity of a queen betrayed but unbroken, she lowered her neck, allowing the torch to spark. Metal screamed as chains cracked and fell. The hatchlings squeaked, scampering forward. One nosed at Ethan's boot, curious, its eyes a mirror of its mother's fire. He stared back, wary yet felt no threat, only the fragile weight of life seeking safety. Kilira watched her child brush against the man and felt a pang, sharp and unexpected. Her kind feared outsiders touching their brood, yet here her hatchling curled against him as if he were kin. The council would call it a disgrace. She called it a sign. When the last shackle fell, Kilira stretched her wings, strength flickering back into her frame. She loomed tall, fire rippling faintly along her throat. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, the acrid tang of burned alloy in his lungs. There. You're free. Her eyes narrowed again, though softer than before. Freedom bought by human hands. Strange days indeed. Ethan leaned against the bulkhead, exhaustion heavy but not regretful. Strange or not, you're alive. And so are they. He nodded toward the hatchlings, who now circled him in cautious play. Kilira folded her wings, curling protectively around her brood. You invite danger, Ethan Cole. The council will hunt me until the stars themselves are ashes. Any who aid me share that fate. He met her gaze without flinching. I've lived through worse than hunters. I'm not leaving you to die. Silence lingered, broken only by the soft chirps of hatchlings. Kilira regarded him for a long breath, measuring resolve she could not understand. Finally she dipped her head, a gesture both regal and resigned. Then walk beside me, human. For now. The hauler drifted deeper into the mining belt, carrying a mother stripped of honor, her fragile young, and a man who had no reason to stay yet chose to. Beyond the asteroids, the galaxy turned indifferent, unaware that an unlikely alliance had just formed. Kilira closed her eyes as her brood nestled against her side. She whispered words meant only for herself, yet the human caught their edge. They cast me out for birthing in the wrong season. Perhaps I was meant to birth in yours. Ethan said nothing. He only adjusted the ship's course, steady hands on the console, steering toward shadows that would hide them a little longer. The chase was not far behind. The asteroid belt became their sanctuary, though calling it safe was generous. Ethan guided his patched-together hauler into the shadows of fractured stone, masking its heat signature among the cold husks of abandoned mines. Every movement was deliberate, every thruster burn calculated to avoid notice. The galaxy might not have noticed them yet, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time. Kilira stretched her wings in the cavernous hollow of the largest asteroid he could find. Her scales caught the dim glow of jury-rigged floodlights Ethan installed along the rock walls, silver and crimson shifting like molten ore. The hatchlings stumbled about in awkward play, testing their wings, occasionally squealing when they tripped over stray cables. The cavern echoed with their chirps, a strange counterpoint to the low hum of generators Ethan had salvaged from wrecks. 4 days he worked, hands calloused and eyes red from sleepless nights. He scoured derelict ships for scraps, welding plating into a makeshift nest that could hold both fire and warmth. He reinforced bulkheads so Kilira's claws wouldn't puncture through, and rigged a heating coil system to mimic the volcanic warmth dragonkind craved. It wasn't elegant, but it kept them alive. Kilira observed him silently at first, her pride bridling against the indignity of relying on a creature barely the height of her forearm. But as the days stretched, she found herself grudgingly admiring the man's relentlessness. He did not pause when sparks seared his skin, nor curse when machinery collapsed under its own weight. He simply picked up the pieces, recalculated, and tried again. You build as if death itself waits at your heels, she remarked one night, her voice reverberating against the stone. Ethan tightened a bolt, sweat dripping into the grime across his brow. Death's always waiting. Trick is making it wait a little longer. Her eyes glowed in the gloom, studying him. You speak like one who has seen too much. I've seen enough. His answer was clipped, final, the kind that discouraged questions. Kilira respected that boundary, though curiosity smoldered. The hatchlings adored him, far more openly than their mother did. They followed him like shadows, tugging at his tools, chirping for attention whenever he sat still too long. One, bolder than the rest, perched atop his workbench, wings half spread as if offering advice. Ethan tolerated them with gruff patience, though on more than one occasion Kilira caught a flicker of softness in his eyes when they nuzzled against his shoulder. But the peace was fragile, more brittle than the steel beams Ethan welded together. News traveled fast in the void. Whispers of an exiled dragon mother and her brood reached ears that profited from the council's decrees. Hunters moved quietly, their ships leaving trails that bled across calm frequencies like faint scars. Ethan intercepted fragments, encrypted signals, brief pings too regular to be random. The net was tightening. He doubled his efforts. Decoy buoys disguised as reactor cores were set to drift nearby, their false heat signatures painting targets where no one lived. Old proximity mines were retooled into EMP snares, concealed along likely approach routes. He rewired his hauler's engines to run cold on minimal output, a trick he learned during ambush drills long ago. Kilira watched his preparations with wary fascination. For a mechanic, you fight like a warlord. Once wore the uniform, Ethan admitted, voice flat as he calibrated a trigger array. Didn't much care for the chain of command. Machines made more sense. Machines bend. They do as they're told. Until they break. He looked at her then, eyes shadowed. People aren't much different. Kilira lowered her head, considering. This human was more than grease and steel. He was a man marked by wars she did not know, battles fought in silence that had scarred him as surely as her exile scarred her wings. The first test came sooner than expected. A patrol ship slid into the belt, its sleek hull painted in the black and gold sigils of the hunters. It prowled like a predator sniffing the air, scanners sweeping in wide arcs. Ethan killed every non-essential system, plunging the cavern into dim half-darkness. The hatchlings squeaked in confusion, but Kilira hushed them with a low growl. Ethan crouched by the monitor, jaw clenched as the patrol drew closer. He flicked a switch, sending one of his decoys drifting into open space. The ship's scanners latched onto it like starving hounds, turning sharply toward the false signal. A burst of plasma fire reduced the decoy to molten slag. The hunters lingered, circling. Then, as if unconvinced, they turned their sensors toward the asteroid itself. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. He could almost feel the weight of Kilira's gaze on his back, the unspoken demand, prove yourself. He pressed another switch. Along the asteroid's outer rim, one of his EMP snares detonated, washing the void with a sudden pulse. The patrol's lights flickered, systems stuttering as their scanners went blind. Ethan seized the moment, activating a thruster burst from a distant drone. The hunters, blinded and convinced by the movement, pursued the wrong quarry. Within minutes they were gone. The cavern exhaled in collective relief. Kilira's claws raked faint lines into the stone. You risked all of us with your tricks, she hissed, though her tone carried more awe than anger. Ethan slumped back in his chair, exhaustion heavy. And it worked. They'll report nothing but ghost signals. Her gaze lingered on him, softer now. A fragile being should not wield such audacity. He smirked, faint and weary. Maybe fragility's what makes us bold. The hatchlings clambered over him then, chirping triumph as if they understood the victory. He endured their weight, even scratched one lightly behind its scaled crest, eliciting a pleased trill. Kilira saw it, and for the first time since exile began, her heart eased. Perhaps this human was more than chance. Perhaps he was necessary. But she knew the council. A single patrol was the beginning, not the end. Hunters would return, stronger, sharper, relentless in their mandate. And the human had marked himself as her ally, which meant he shared her doom. That night, as Ethan repaired a crack in the generator housing, Kilira spoke without preamble. The council will not relent. They will come with fleets, with fire, until either I am ash or my hatchlings are slaughtered. Ethan tightened the weld, sparks casting fleeting constellations across his grim features. Then we make sure they regret trying. You would defy an empire for me? He met her eyes, steady, unflinching. Not for you. For them. He nodded toward the sleeping hatchlings, curled together in the warmth of recycled coils. Kilira lowered her gaze, pride and sorrow warring within her. She had been cast out for birthing in the wrong season. Yet here, among stone and shadow, she wondered if exile had led her not to ruin but to an alliance the council could never have predicted. Ethan powered down the torch, the cavern returning to quiet hums and distant echoes. Get some rest, he murmured. Tomorrow I'll shore up the east wall. If they come back, I want this place ready. Kilira said nothing. She curled around her brood, wings folding close, eyes never leaving the human who worked tirelessly for lives not his own. In her chest, fire stirred, not of wrath but of something older, rarer. Trust, fragile and dangerous. And beyond the asteroid belt, the hunters whispered to each other of a human scene where none should be, and of a dragon's shadow that had not yet faded. The asteroid nest could no longer be considered hidden. Ethan knew at the moment the scanners caught a ripple of movement in the black, too precise to be random debris, too steady to be natural drift. The hunters had returned, and this time they came prepared. He stood at the console, jaw tight, as red markers multiplied across the holomap. Kilira loomed behind him, her breath hot enough to fog the steel bulkheads. The hatchlings whimpered at her claws, sensitive to the unease in their mother's chest. "They have doubled their number," she rumbled. "Perhaps tripled. The council means to end this." Ethan's voice was calm, but his hands moved with relentless speed across the controls. "Then we don't wait for them to box us in. We make them bleed for every step." Her wings twitched, scales rippling like liquid fire. She had seen armies routed and citadels burned, but never had she seen a single human stand so steadfast against overwhelming force. Pride mingled with dread. He was clever, yes, but cleverness alone did not defeat fleets. The first barrage came swift and merciless. Plasma rounds hammered the asteroid's crust, shaking the cavern as if the void itself had grown teeth. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The hatchlings shrieked and Kilira coiled protectively around them. Ethan's traps ignited one after another, mines detonating in bursts of white-hot light, drones spitting electromagnetic pulses that scrambled hunter comms. Several ships spun off course, their engines sputtering. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Not enough," he muttered. Kilira stretched her neck, eyes narrowing. "Then let me fight." He turned to her, welding torch still gripped in his hand from earlier repairs. "Your wings not healed. They'll tear you apart." Her growl reverberated like distant thunder. "Better torn apart in battle than to watch my brood die caged." For a long heartbeat, the human and the dragon locked eyes, defiance meeting resolve. Then Ethan exhaled sharply, a sound between surrender and decision. "Fine. But not bear." He ran to the workbench, dragging out the plating he had scavenged from a wrecked freighter. Chunks of scorched hull metal, curved and hammered by his hands, became makeshift armor. With swift movements, he strapped the plating along her wings and shoulders, welding edges tight against her scales. Kilira flexed, testing the weight. The armor clattered, crude yet sturdy. She regarded him with a flicker of something almost like reverence. "You forge war gifts like a smith of legends." He smirked faintly. "Just a mechanic with too much scrap." The hunters breached the cavern's outer wall. Their boots thundered on stone as they poured in, weapons raised, armor glowing with council sigils. Ethan crouched behind a fallen beam, plasma cutter in hand, while Kilira surged forward, armored wings unfurling like a storm given form. The battle was chaos wrapped in fire. Ethan triggered detonators that sent stone collapsing onto squads. Kilira's roar split the air, a blast of flame igniting fuel pods Ethan had rigged along the cavern floor. The explosion painted the chamber in blinding orange, vaporizing half a squad. Hatchlings, though small, reacted instinctively, darting behind Ethan, hissing sparks of fire that startled attackers. One leapt forward to shield him, catching a plasma bolt across its shoulder. It screeched but held firm. Ethan's chest clenched at the sight. Without thought, he dragged the hatchling behind cover, checking the wound. Its scales smoked, but to his shock, the burn was already sealing. Faster than any healing he had ever seen. Kilira fought like a tempest, armored wings smashing soldiers against walls, claws raking steel as easily as cloth. She was fury incarnate, but her fire was not mindless. She fought to shield the nest, to hold the hunters at bay long enough for her children to survive. Ethan moved with her, darting from shadow to shadow, cutting down enemies who slipped past her reach. He was not the strongest nor the fastest, but he was precise. Every movement served purpose, every strike designed to protect, not conquer. Together they became a rhythm, the raw power of dragonkind intertwined with human ingenuity. But the hunters pressed harder. Reinforcements poured through the breach. Ethan's traps were nearly spent, his ammunition dwindling. Sweat burned his eyes as he rewired one last explosive, setting it along the cavern's fuel line. "Kilira," he shouted. "Drive them toward the east wall." Without hesitation, she surged, wings beating thunder into the chamber. The hunters stumbled under the onslaught, hurting unwillingly into the line Ethan marked. He slammed the detonator. The cavern erupted. Flame and shrapnel devoured the east wall, collapsing stone and steel in a deafening avalanche. The hunters were buried beneath rubble, their advance crushed under tons of wreckage. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of fire and the pained chirps of hatchlings. Kilira sagged, wings trembling, smoke rising from her armored plates. Ethan staggered to her side, lungs raw from dust. "They'll send more," he rasped. "This place won't hold." Her eyes burned with both exhaustion and grim pride. "You saved us." He shook his head. "We bought time. That's all." She looked at the collapsed wall, at the ruin of what had been their fragile sanctuary. Her brood pressed close, clinging to her scales. For the first time since exile, Kilira felt the weight of despair claw at her heart. She had thought herself strong enough to outlast the council's fury. But she saw now, the nest could not endure. Ethan rested a hand against the scarred plating he had welded to her wing. "We need to move. Find somewhere bigger, safer. Somewhere they won't expect." Her gaze turned to him, studying the lines carved into his face by smoke and fire. He was battered, human, breakable in 100 ways. Yet he stood as if unshaken, already planning the next move, already preparing for battles yet to come. "You speak as though survival is inevitable," she murmured. He met her eyes without hesitation. "Because it has to be. For them." The hatchlings stirred, their eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Ethan saw not weakness but a future the council feared. He understood then why they hunted so relentlessly. These hatchlings were not just out of season. They were different, stronger, destined to change everything if they lived. Kilira lowered her head, exhaustion softening her voice. "Then we leave. But if we fall, it will not be in shadows. It will be before their gates." Ethan nodded, resolve hardening. "Then we'll make them listen." The cavern groaned under the weight of ruin, dust still drifting like pale ghosts in the firelight. Together, human and dragon gathered the hatchlings, stepping into the uncertain dark of the tunnels beyond. Behind them lay the ashes of safety. Ahead waited the heart of the council itself. And for the first time, Kilira did not feel alone in her exile. The tunnels twisted for days, carved long ago by miners who had fled when the veins ran dry. Ethan guided them with a salvaged scanner, mapping collapsed shafts and hidden exits while Kilira carried the hatchlings close against her chest. They emerged at last into open void, the ruined asteroid a shrinking shadow behind them. There was no going back. Ethan had already chosen their next step. A derelict freighter drifted a few sectors away, a graveyard ship abandoned after a reactor breach. To most scavengers it was worthless, more curse than prize. To Ethan, it was the foundation of survival. With Kilira's strength in his hands, they could turn it into a fortress that moved. The vessel loomed as they approached, a rusted titan sprawled against the stars, hull ruptured and decks warped by fire. Ethan docked his battered hauler against its flank and guided Kilira inside. The freighter's cavernous holds offered space enough for her to stretch her wings, though the air stank of stale smoke and coolant. "It reeks of death," she growled, nostrils flaring. "Then no one else will come sniffing around," Ethan answered, already prying open a panel with his cutter. "Perfect for us." Work began at once. Ethan stripped circuits and rewired conduits, building a skeleton of power from scraps. He taught the hatchlings to fetch tools, their small claws surprisingly dexterous as they carried wrenches and coils. Kilira, despite her pride, bent her strength to his plans, hauling collapsed beams, crushing twisted steel so he could shape it anew. Slowly the dead ship breathed again. Ethan's vision stretched further than repair. He set up turrets rigged from mining lasers, controlled by crude voice relays the hatchlings could trigger. He patched the comm array, tuning it not to broadcast but to listen. Kilira watched him thread cables across the vast chamber, every movement purposeful. "You arm us like a warship," she said one evening, her voice low as the hatchlings slept. He didn't look up from the terminal. "Because they'll come again, and next time we won't have stone walls to hide behind." Her gaze lingered. "You plan not only to fight but to march into their heart." Ethan's hands stilled for a moment. He thought of the patrols, of the bounty already whispered across channels. He thought of the hatchling that had bled for him, and how quickly the wound had sealed. The council's decree wasn't about tradition. It was about fear. "They'll never stop chasing you," he said at last. "So we stop running. Make them hear your voice where they can't ignore it." Kilira's chest rumbled with conflicted fire. To challenge the council was folly, but exile had already stripped her of honor. Perhaps Ethan's madness was the only path left. Their journey began when the freighter stirred to life. Engines groaned, reactors shuddered, but under Ethan's steady guidance, the ship lumbered forward. It was no sleek warship, but it carried something greater. Determination carved into every bolt, defiance burned into every circuit. The path to the council's world was treacherous. Patrol routes bristled with blockades. Ethan charted detours through debris fields and radiation storms, threading between dangers that would have gutted lesser crews. Kilira kept the hatchlings close, teaching them formation flights within the freighter's cavernous bays. Their movements grew sharper, more instinctive, echoing the discipline of a pack drilled by survival. They weren't alone for long. As the freighter limped through forgotten sectors, signals reached them, refugee ships, ragged and weary, fleeing the council's taxes and decrees. They hailed Ethan cautiously, only to find themselves granted shelter in the dragon-haunted freighter. At first they feared Kilira, eyes wide with terror at her size and her flame. But when they saw her curl her body around her hatchlings, when they saw the human mechanic speaking to her as equal, fear gave way to awe. "The human stands with the dragon," whispered a trader with hollow eyes. Word spread quickly among the desperate. More ships joined, ragged flotillas trailing in the freighter's wake. Kilira warned him one night, her voice sharp despite exhaustion. "Every soul that follows paints a brighter target. The council will see us not as exiles but as rebellion." Ethan didn't argue. He simply stared at the growing fleet through the viewport. Then let them call it what it is. Days stretched into weeks, and with each step closer to the council's core systems, tension thickened. Hunters prowled at the edges, watching but not yet striking, waiting for the command to fall. Inside the freighter, life hardened into rhythm. Ethan drilled the refugees in basic defense, Kilira trained the hatchlings to fly tighter, faster. Between lessons he built a translator rig, strapping it across her throat and wings so her roars could be woven into council frequencies. The first time it worked, her voice filled the comm chamber not as growls but as words. "I am Kilira of the Crimson Line. You will hear me." Ethan allowed himself the barest smile. "Now they can't pretend you're just an animal." Her eyes glowed like embers. "They never feared me as an animal. They fear me as a mother." The final stretch loomed, the council's homeworld, a jewel wrapped in defensive fleets and orbital bastions. The refugees grew silent as they neared, aware that survival here was measured not in days but in heartbeats. Ethan prepared with the calm precision of a man who had already accepted his role. He calibrated the freighter's weapons, tested the translator, checked Kilira's armor. The hatchlings watched him intently, their eyes mirrors of fire and steel. One mimicked his movements, chirping as if in command. Ethan's lips quirked, though his gaze remained hard. "Not yet, little one. Soon enough." Kilira lowered her head beside him, her breath warm against his shoulder. "You march into the jaws of the council as if it were a machine to be fixed." "Machines break," he said, fastening the last plate onto her wing. "So do tyrants." The council's world grew on the horizon, a sphere bathed in golden light, its skies armored by fleets larger than anything Ethan had faced before. Refugees shuddered, some whispering prayers, others falling into silence. Ethan stared at the display without flinching. Kilira coiled close, her hatchlings pressed against her side. She studied the man who had turned exile into defiance, who had bound his fragile fate to hers. In her chest, fire burned steady, not with wrath alone but with something heavier, conviction. The comm crackled with a demand from the blockade, cold and imperious. "Unidentified freighter, power down and prepare for boarding. Failure to comply is execution." Ethan leaned into the mic, voice steady as iron. "Not today." He cut the channel and engines flared. The freighter surged forward, refugees clinging to hope, a dragon's brood snarling for survival, and a human mechanic steering straight into the heart of an empire. The blockade closed around them, shields shimmering, weapons charging. Kilira spread her armored wings, hatchlings hissing flame into the void. Ethan's hands tightened on the controls, every calculation done, every risk accepted. They had left behind shadows and hiding places. Now there was only the council's gaze, sharp and merciless, waiting to crush them. Ethan spoke without turning, his words for Kilira alone. "We're past the point of running. Time to make them listen." And with that, the first volley lit the dark and war began. The void split open with light and fury as the council's blockade unleashed its opening salvo. Energy bolts screamed across the dark, painting the freighter's battered hull in searing white flashes. Refugee ships scattered, diving into cover, but the council's warships pressed forward in ruthless formation. Ethan's knuckles whitened on the controls, every instinct tuned to the machine beneath him. The freighter groaned under stress, shields flaring as improvised arrays strained to hold. He shouted orders into the comms, voice sharp and unyielding. "Stay behind our hull. Use our shadow as cover. Kilira, ready the hatchlings." Kilira's roar answered him, a sound that rattled the ship's bones. She launched from the bay with her brood in tow, wings armored in scavenged plating, talons tipped with sharpened alloy. The hatchlings followed tight, flames spilling from their mouths in arcs that defied the void. To the council fleet, it must have looked like a nightmare reborn, dragons in the cold of space, fire burning where fire should not exist. The first council frigate moved to intercept, shields blazing as it angled toward Kilira. Ethan's hands flew over the console, rerouting power to forward cannons. The freighter belched a storm of mining laser fire, crude but relentless, tearing across the frigate's defenses. Kilira dove past the wreckage, talons raking steel, her hatchling spitting fire into ruptured wounds. The frigate's core exploded in a burst of orange light, and silence followed for a heartbeat, disbelief spreading through the council lines. "They see us," Kilira growled over the comm, her voice now translated and broadcast across the sector. "Not as exiles. Not as prey. But as truth." Her words hit like a hammer. Ethan gritted his teeth, knowing they had only moments before the council regrouped. Already, cruisers shifted formation, cutting off escape, preparing to swarm. A refugee captain's voice crackled through. "We can't hold against them, mechanic. There are too many." Ethan's response was iron. "Then we don't hold. We break them." Kilira banked, flames spilling in a defiant arc that lit her wings like banners. Her hatchlings followed, weaving through incoming fire with reckless precision. Ethan drove the freighter forward, ramming through the shattered debris of the first frigate to clear a path. Refugee ships, emboldened, surged behind him, firing what weapons they had, their ragged flotilla now a spear aimed at the council's heart. The council's command ship loomed ahead, a colossus bristling with weapons, its gilded hull gleaming like arrogance incarnate. That was where the order had come, where the decree of exile had been signed. Kilira's eyes burned as she fixed upon it, wings folding as she dove. "That is the throat we strike." Ethan recalibrated the freighter's systems, every circuit bending toward one goal: deliver Kilira to that ship's bridge. He rerouted coolant lines, overcharged the reactors, and silenced the alarms screaming warnings. "We'll never get close unless we burn everything we've got." "Then burn it," she replied without hesitation. The hatchlings swarmed ahead, harrying interceptors, their flames forcing sleek machines into erratic spirals. Kilira tore through gunships, her roar shaking pilots into panic. Refugee fire peppered the council's shields, not enough to break them but enough to distract, to bleed. The freighter thundered forward, engines screaming as they pushed past design. Hull plating peeled away in the rush, but Ethan's focus never wavered. He was the mechanic and the machine was his voice. "Hold steady, girl," he whispered to the dying ship as if it could hear him. "One last run." The command ship opened fire with everything it had, beams lancing across the void. The freighter shuddered, half its shields gone, power flickering. Ethan slammed controls, cutting non-essential systems, feeding every drop of energy into propulsion. Kilira surged alongside, her body shielding weak points, flames spewing into turrets that dared target the freighter. They breached the outer shield in a blaze of fire and steel. The freighter's hull tore as it passed through, alarms howling, atmosphere venting in shrieking torrents. Ethan barely registered it. His eyes were locked on the gaping wound ahead. "Now Kilira. Go." The dragon launched, wings aflame, hatchlings screaming behind her. They tore into the command ship like a living storm, claws rending corridors, fire filling voidless air. Council soldiers scattered, weapons useless against scale and flame. Kilira's translator broadcast every roar as a voice, echoing across comms. "You decreed exile upon me. You decreed death upon my brood. I decree your silence." Ethan staggered from the freighter's ruined cockpit, mag boots clamping him to the torn deck. He dragged himself into the breach, cutter in one hand, rifle in the other. Refugee fighters swarmed into the wound behind him, emboldened by dragonfire. The battle surged into the command core, a cathedral of glass and light where the council's high lords presided. Kilira burst through the chamber wall, wings unfurling to fill the space, flames licking the air like banners of war. Her hatchlings ringed her, small but fierce, their fire adding to hers until the lords cowered beneath the heat. Ethan strode beside her, soot streaked across his face, eyes cold as steel. He leveled his weapon, but it was not the rifle that carried the weight. It was his words. "You wanted her gone because she broke your order. Because she gave life when it didn't suit your rules. You wanted her children buried because they didn't fit your season." Kilira's voice rolled over his, a furnace turned into words. "I am Kilira of the Crimson Line. I am mother to flame. And I will not bow." The chamber trembled with her roar. The hatchlings added their cries, shrill and defiant, the sound of a future refusing to be strangled. The lords, for all their gilded armor and command seals, could not stand beneath that tide. They faltered, voices breaking, the weight of their edicts crumbling. Ethan lowered his weapon, his eyes never leaving theirs. "You tried to bury her. Instead she rose. And she's not alone." Across the system, comm channels erupted. Refugees, miners, forgotten colonies, every soul that had been silenced heard Kilira's voice, heard her flame woven into words. What had begun as exile became declaration, not whispered rebellion but shouted truth. The council's fleets faltered as crews hesitated, doubt infecting command. The High Lords broke, retreating into shadows, stripped of the silence they had commanded for centuries. And in their place stood a dragon and a human, flame and steel bound together, no longer hidden, no longer prey. The battle ended not with the council's total destruction, but with their voice shattered. Refugees claimed ships, colonies declared freedom, and the council's power fractured. Kilira stood in the ruins of their chamber, hatchlings curling around her talons, wings spread wide. Ethan leaned against her flank, exhausted but unbroken, his hand resting on warm scales. She looked down at him, fire still smoldering in her chest. You carried me into their heart. You bound my voice to theirs. What are you, Ethan Holt, that you do this? He managed a weary grin, eyes soft despite the wreckage. Just a mechanic who hates when people break things that don't belong to them. Kilira's laughter rumbled like thunder, shaking dust from the chamber walls. Then perhaps you were always more. My brood will know your name as they know mine. The hatchlings pressed against them both, fire flickering from their jaws, the future burning bright in their eyes. Beyond the shattered windows, the fleet of refugees circled, no longer broken, no longer fleeing. For the first time in years, Kilira lifted her head not as exile, but as sovereign. Ethan stood beside her, his presence a quiet defiance, proof that even the smallest hands could mend what empires tried to destroy. The council's banners fell silent, replaced by the roar of flame and the steady hum of a freighter rebuilt into legend. And in that silence, the universe shifted, reshaped by the bond between a human mechanic and the dragon mother they had tried to erase. The war was not over, but it had begun on their terms. And for the first time the stars themselves seemed to listen.